How's it going, everybody? Daner here with North Central Coins, and welcome back to another exciting episode of the most rare and valuable coins in Canada. In today's video, we're taking a look at the top 5 modern Canadian pennies with rare varieties that are worth big money. Now, these are all from the Queen Elizabeth II era, and they're the kind of heirs and varieties that most people will overlook. The best part about these coins is that you might already have some of them sitting in your collection or change jar right now. Before we do get into this, I would really appreciate if you guys would smash that thumbs up, subscribe if you're new, and also ring that bell notification so you don't miss out on any of my new content. And then without any further ado, let's get right into it and break down the top 5 modern Canadian penny varieties worth big money. Let's get it, guys. If you happen to have any old Canadian pennies tucked away in a jar, buried in a desk, or inherited from a relative, now is the time to pull them out and give them a close inspection. Because one incredibly rare piece from the year 1966 can make the difference between a common copper cent worth only a few pennies and one of the rarest finds in all of Canadian numismatics. The mid-60s were a pivotal era for Canadian coins. At the time, the Canadian Mint was moving away from the traditional compositions for the higher denominations, replacing silver with nickel for dimes, quarters, half dollars, and the silver dollar. During this shift, Canadian Mint engineers experimented with new compositions for the Canadian penny, exploring alternatives to the long-standing copper-bronze mix. That is where the 1966 pattern cent or pattern penny comes in. These coins are sometimes referred to as trial or test pieces, and this 1966 nickel penny is referred to as Charlton number DC-32. This coin was struck in nickel, which is a silvery gray metal, unlike the reddish-brown copper alloy used for regular pennies. Its existence captures a pivotal moment when the Canadian Mint was searching for its next generation of coinage. Although this trial piece never progressed to actual circulation, its significance has only grown over time. Finding information on one-of-a-kind rare coins like the 1966 trial or pattern test nickel penny can prove extremely difficult. Today, it's one of the least known test or trial pieces in Canadian numismatics, and only a handful of examples have been found and accounted for, if that. Here's some of the key things that you can look for that might help you spot this rare 1966 pattern penny versus the common copper bronze counterpart. First, the composition and color of the coins is completely different. The regular 1966 Canadian penny is struck in the common 98% copper, 0.5% tin, and 1.5% zinc, which is referred to as bronze. And the pattern 1966 penny is struck in pure nickel. So the easiest way to be able to tell if you have one of these rare pattern cents is to check the composition and the color. If it is the regular 1966 penny, it will be red or brown, and if you have the extremely rare pattern cent, it will appear silver. Another clear difference between the regular 1966 cent and the 1966 pattern nickel penny is the weight. The regular penny will have a weight of 3.24 grams, and the nickel pattern will actually come in slightly heavier at 3.5 grams. Regular 1966 copper pennies will not stick to a magnet, but if you find the 1966 pattern nickel 1 cent coin, it will actually be magnetic, so it will stick to a magnet. So if you are able to find a silver 1966 penny, the second test that you can do is try and see if it will stick to the magnet. So what is it that actually makes this coin so rare and desirable? The 1966 nickel pattern penny emerged from a period when the Canadian Mint was exploring new compositions for its lowest denomination. As higher denomination coins switched to nickel, this pattern penny was an experimental attempt to create a durable and cost-effective Canadian 1 cent coin. However, for reasons lost to history, possibly cost-related, engineering constraints, or public reception, this design and composition never progressed beyond the experimental phase. Today, examples of pattern test or trial coins are exceedingly rare. Based off of similar test, trial, or pattern coins, I would say that there are probably fewer than 5 examples of this piece in existence, if that. This coin's level of rarity, combined with its status as a relic of a pivotal era in Canadian coinage, makes the 1966 pattern penny one of the holy grails for any collector. So if you're like me and you have a big old stash of Canadian pennies from the 1960s, don't dismiss that odd silvery looking coin just yet. Even the most subtle differences, like the coin's magnetic properties, its color, and weight, might signal that you've uncovered one of the rarest and most significant pieces in modern Canadian numismatics. For the right collector, a 1966 nickel pattern penny could be worth thousands of dollars, and its allure goes far beyond its value. It's a piece of the Canadian Mint's experimental past, a relic of a time when every tiny design and material shift could have reshaped the future of Canadian currency. Now, some of the details and specifications of any of these are off and may indicate that it is not a legitimate or authentic example. Online auction sites like Temu and AliExpress are littered with Canadian counterfeit coins, and unfortunately, it's one-of-a-kind pieces like this pattern penny that fall victim to counterfeiting. So it's always important, if you think you have found something unique or special, to do your due diligence to make sure all of the details line up before you take it in to be appraised or send it in to be graded. So the 1966 nickel pattern 1-cent coin is classified as Charlton code DC-32. It has an alloy and composition of nickel, which will give it its silver appearance. It is magnetic, which means it will stick to a magnet, unlike the common copper penny from 1966. It should have a weight of 3.5 grams, which is 0.26 grams more heavy than the common 1966 penny. It will have a diameter of 19.05 millimeters. Now, what do you say we get into the current market values for this extremely rare penny? So if you're able to identify all of those factors and the specifications all line up, if you send this coin in to be graded, it is going to be classified as a specimen coin, as most test, trial, and pattern pieces are. But although they are classed as specimen coins, they actually did not come out of specimen sets. They are patterns, tests, or trials that were struck as an experiment at the mint and were not meant to be released into circulation. So if you're able to find and identify one of these, if it scores around the SP63 mark, which is specimen 63, it can be worth around $1,500. If it scores around SP64, it can be worth around $2,000. And if it scores around SP65, you are looking at around a $2,500 coin, and that is currently the highest appraised price value for this piece. If you did find one and it scored any higher, you could see some little price jumps. We could easily be talking a $3,500, $5,000 coin if it scored in the high SP mark. Now, I do want to point out that your chances of finding coins like this in your pocket change or looking through your coin jars are pretty much slim to nil, but never say never. Some of the rarest coins of all time were discovered through pocket change and coin roll hunting. Even though extremely rare coins like patterns, tests, or trials were not meant to be released into circulation, it doesn't mean that a few of them didn't accidentally escape the mint facility, either snuck out by mint employees, or maybe they made their way into the big batches of pennies that were being struck. Regardless, they have been found and accounted for in the past, and the only way that you will ever be able to find one and make the big bucks is to know what to look for. If you do ever think that you have found any of the coins that I discussed in any of my videos, I definitely suggest you join our Facebook group, Canadian Coin Roll Hunters. We have around 20,000 members right now, and if you want any information regarding error coins or rare finds, just post some pictures and ask for some info, and either myself or one of the many group experts will be more than willing to share our opinion. The Canadian penny was officially released in the year 1858. Those were referred to as large cents or large pennies, and those remained into effect until the year 1920 when the size changed. The composition has changed many times over the years, with some of the early Canadian pennies being minted out of bronze or brass, and then eventually out of pure copper, and now out of steel plated with copper on the outside. The diameter of the penny has also changed over time, with 19.05 millimeters being the most current and well-known measurement, very similar to the American small cent. Even though the Canadian penny is no longer manufactured for circulation after the year 2012, it is still produced for collector sets, such as the specimen and proof sets released by the Canadian Mint. These collections frequently feature limited edition pennies to mark important occasions or anniversaries. Even though they aren't as widely available as they previously may have been, you can still discover pennies if you look long and hard enough. Despite its discontinuation, it still remains a highly collected item. Some of the places that you can get pennies here in Canada are from your bank by asking for a $25 box or some loose rolls, and first of all hoping that they have any, and secondly are ready to break procedure in order to give them to you. Unfortunately, every financial institution in Canada is obligated to return any pennies that have been returned to be melted down. Despite this, and also the existence of businesses like Brinks and Garter World, which also operate their own alloy recycling programs, you still may be able to find some pennies out in the wild today. Aside from financial institutions, you could always take a gander on Facebook Marketplace or Kijiji, and you can also check out your local neighborhood coin shop to see if they have any bulk pennies that you can purchase. Now that we've given you guys some information on the Canadian penny, what do you say we get into these 1962 penny errors and variations, because there are a whole lot that we have to cover here, and they can all be worth some really good money if you can identify any of them. So as I mentioned earlier, there are upwards of 10 different errors or variations you can look for when it comes to your Canadian 1962 pennies. The first are the hanging varieties, the most common of which is the single hanging 2. If you look above the digit of 2 on the reverse of the coin, there should be a little line that connects from the top of the 2, curving upwards and then horizontally to the left until it touches the maple leaf. This is the result of a die clash, and depending on how late into production the dies were used with this error, the more significant it can become. There are also double and even triple hanging 2s, and the more of these die clashes or lines you can count, the more valuable this variety becomes. Then there's the missing M variety. Usually Canadian pennies will have the initial of MG at the bottom of the portrait of Queen Elizabeth on the obverse. In 1962, whether due to die deterioration or other technical difficulties, the M in the initial is actually not visible. This variety can also be compounded with the hanging varieties to make it a double error and increase the value substantially. There can also be doubling on the final 3 digits of the date in 1962, and depending on how many of the digits are doubled and also the significance of the doubling, it can be quite valuable. The last 2 notable variations for the 1962 Canadian pennies are also by far the most cool, and those are the guitar and harp variations. As a guitar player my whole life, this is a penny that has been on my radar for a long time, and I still have not been blessed by one of these by the coin gods, but I know other coin roll hunters who have found them, so they are out there. To identify and differentiate between the harp and guitar strings, you have to look underneath the 1 in the 1 cent on the top of the reverse of the coin, and if there are lines running vertically from the 1 to the top of the maple leaf, then you have one of these 2 very rare coins. The harp lines or strings would appear wider and more spread apart and may not be running all the way down and making contact with the maple leaf. The guitar lines or strings would be more narrow and more pronounced and would run clearly, making contact with the maple leaf. The guitar is the rarer and more valuable of the 2 varieties, so that is the one that you want to look for, but finding either one of these would definitely be a nice little treat. Now that we've discussed how to identify some of these varieties, what do you say we get into the values for these pennies? First, we will discuss the 1962 single hanging 2. One thing I do want to point out as well is most of these pennies aren't worth too much on the low end. They aren't worth too much more than face value. You might be able to get a couple dollars for them if somebody really wants them or they're trying to fill a hole in their collection. But usually to get the most amount of money from the coins that I'm mentioning, you want them to be in a high grade state. So that means MS60 to MS67. So to identify the single hanging 2 1962, you want to look for the hook that connects from the top of the 2 to the bottom of the maple leaf. If you can identify that, it can be worth around $9 for an MS60 to an MS62 example. This one can be worth around $300 for an MS66, and it could easily be worth up to $500 to $750 if you were to find one and it scored an MS67, which is extremely hard for Canadian coins. It's very rare that Canadian coins score MS66 or MS67, but never say never. If you're able to find an uncirculated roll of these, there's no reason they may be able to score a high grade like the MS66 or MS67 territory. Then there's the 1962 double hanging 2. Now to identify this one, it'll be very similar to the single hanging 2, but you want to look for multiple lines. There should be at least 2 of them. And in terms of value, it can be worth around $800 for an MS67 example, so it is just slightly more valuable and rare than the single hanging 2 variety. And then there is the triple hanging 2. Now this one is much more rare than the single or double hanging 2 varieties. It's worth around $38 if you find one in an MS60 or MS62, but you see some massive price jumps with this coin. If you were to find one and it scored anywhere near an MS66 or MS67, it could easily be worth thousands of dollars. If it scored in the MS67 territory, you could easily be talking a $3,000 coin. This is a pretty significant error for it to have 3 die clashes and get the triple hanging designation. So definitely the hanging 2s are good varieties to look for. Then there's the 1962 missing M variety. To identify this one, you want to look at the bottom of the portrait of Queen Elizabeth. And in most cases, when you check for this error, you're going to see the initials MG. But if you ever check and that M is missing, you have one rare 1962 penny that can be worth $377 for an MS66 example. And this coin could see a significant price jump as well. It could easily be worth up to $750 if it did score in the MS67 range. Now, even more rare and valuable than the missing M variety is the 1962 missing M with a hanging 2. Now, this would be known as a double error because it contains 2 significant errors. So to identify this, it needs to have the die clash, giving it the hanging 2, and it will also have the missing M for the initials MG. If you can identify both of these, it can be worth around $205 for an MS65, but it could be worth all the way up to $2,500 for an MS67 if you were to find one and it graded that high. It would seem that they were having a lot of problems with their dies in the year 1962, and your chances of being able to find some of these pennies, even with a double error, are not the worst ever. So keep your eyes out for a missing M and a hanging 2 on your 1962 pennies. Then there are the 1962s that can contain doubling on the final 3 digits. Now, if it has a double 2, it can be worth around $50 for an MS65. If it has a doubled 9, 6, and 2, so the final 3 digits all contain machine doubling or die deterioration, then it adds a pretty significant premium. It can be worth around $100 for an MS65, so the price actually jumps to 2 times the value if it only has doubling on the single digit. And it could easily see some massive price jumps and be worth up to $500 to $1,000 if it's scored in the MS67 range. And then last but not least, we have the 2 string varieties of the 1962 pennies, and those are the harp and guitar string varieties. Now first is the harp variety. To identify this, you want to look below the 1 on 1 cent on the reverse of the coin, and there should be lines running vertically from the bottom of the 1 to the top of the maple leaf. The strings on the harp will look wider and less pronounced. This one can be worth around $380 for an MS66 example, but if you were to find one and it scored any higher, it could be worth up to $1,000 for an MS67. Now, the 1962 guitar variety is the rarer of the 2 string varieties for the 1962 pennies. It's worth around $100 for an MS64 example, so it's probably worth around $300 for an MS65. Currently, MS64 is the highest graded known example, so if you were able to find one of the 1962 guitar pennies and it graded any higher than MS64, then you would have one very, very rare coin that could easily be worth up to $1,500 for an MS67. To identify this, you want to look under the 1 on 1 cent on the reverse of the coin, and it should have lines running vertically connecting to the top of the maple leaf. The lines should be more narrow and more pronounced on the guitar variety. In the late 1990s, the Canadian Mint found itself in quite a pickle. Metal costs were rising and continuing to strike coins out of the traditional materials like pure nickel or copper alloys was becoming unsustainable. To keep producing durable, high-quality coins while also cutting costs, the Canadian Mint developed what became known as the multiply plated steel technology. This new and revolutionary process involved striking coins on a steel core, then plating them with thin layers of nickel and copper. To the naked eye, these coins looked and felt just like the older versions, but they were far cheaper to produce. Before rolling out this technology to the public, the Canadian Mint needed to make sure that it would actually work in practice. In the year 1999, the Canadian Mint struck experimental sets of coins and also individual pieces from the 1 cent all the way up to the 50-cent denominations and provided them to vending machine companies across the country. These businesses needed real coins to calibrate their machines properly, and the Mint saw it as the perfect opportunity to field test the new plating technology. But once real coins are released out into the wild, even in small numbers, some will inevitably fall into collectors' hands. And that is exactly what happened here. And the buzz around these rare test coins quickly grew among Canadian numismatists. To distinguish the plated coins from their more common counterparts, the Mint added a tiny P composition mark beneath the bust of Queen Elizabeth on the obverse. Now, this isn't technically considered a mint mark like the W that is used for the Winnipeg Mint on the obverse of some collector sets, but this is actually considered a composition mark, and the P stands for multiply plated. Sets with P composition mark coins were released in 1999 specifically in collector's sets, but when it came to the following year, the 2000 dated pennies, dimes, and quarters were never intended to reach the public at all. And yet, a few examples of each of these different denominations have slipped through the cracks. To this day, only 8 certified examples of the 2000p Canadian penny are known to exist, and all of them are in mint state. This definitely puts it in the category of holy grail coins, which I would consider pieces that are so rare that most collectors will only ever hear about them and never actually hold in their hands. But when it comes to coin collecting and coin roll hunting, you can never really say never, because these things have been discovered before in the wild, whether by searching through pocket change or coin roll hunting. They are out there and just waiting to be discovered, and if you hunt it, eventually you will find it. To truly appreciate just how different and rare the 2000p Canadian penny is, it helps to compare it with the other 2 versions that were made in the year 2000. First, we have the regular 2000 Canadian penny, which was struck in staggering numbers. Over 771 million pieces of the regular 2000 Canadian penny were produced. These were composed of copper-plated zinc, they were non-magnetic, and they are still extremely common to find if you are searching through Canadian pennies. Unless you happen to pull out an extremely high-grade example, they don't carry much value beyond their face. Then there is also the 2000 W penny, which will have a small W mint mark located to the bottom right-hand side of Queen Elizabeth's bust on the obverse, and this is put there to indicate that it was struck at the Winnipeg Mint. Now, it is technically slightly more scarce and valuable than the regular circulation issue, but it's still relatively easy to buy in sets, and you can even find these in your coin roll hunts. I did a hunt with one of my buddies and he found a 2000 Winnipeg Mint Canadian penny. They're only worth a couple dollars. They can maybe be worth 20 or 30 if they are in really good shape. And then we have the most rare and valuable of the Canadian 2000 pennies, which is the P-marked version. These pennies were struck on copper-plated steel, and they will be magnetic, unlike the regular and the Winnipeg Mint. For collectors, proper identification is crucial. First, you want to check the date. You want to make sure that the penny is from the year 2000. Then you want to flip over to the obverse. You want to look under the bust of Queen Elizabeth and look for a small P mint mark directly beneath her bust. If you can identify those features, the next step is to do a magnet test. A legitimate 2000p penny will be magnetic because of its steel core, when both the regular 2000 and 2000W pennies are struck on zinc planchettes and will not respond to a magnet. This simple check can save you a lot of time, since any non-magnetic 2000 cents can immediately be ruled out as something other than the rare variety, and you can know that it is more than likely not legitimate. Now, before we get into the potential values, let's go over the exact specifications for the 2000p Canadian penny, because these details are crucial when it comes to spotting counterfeits or altered coins. Now, the overall mintage for the 2000 Canadian penny is 771,908,206. So a lot of pennies were made in the year 2000. And even though they made well over 771 million pennies in the year 2000, there are only 8 certified examples of the 2000p Canadian penny known to exist currently. The 2000p penny should be composed of copper-plated steel, which is a 94% steel core and then plated with 4.5% copper and 1.5% nickel. It should have a weight of 2.35 grams, which is actually slightly heavier than the 2.25 grams that the regular 2000 and 2000W Canadian pennies have. It should have a diameter of 19.05 millimeters, a thickness of 1.45 millimeters. The edge should be smooth. The 2000P will be magnetic, while the regular and Winnipeg issues are non-magnetic. The obverse was designed by Dorda Padry Hunt and the reverse by G.E. Kruger Gray. The small weight discrepancy and the magnetism are the key identifiers when it comes to the 2000P. They are what sets this coin apart from its less rare cousins from the same year. Because so few examples of this piece exist, making sure a coin matches these specs is the only way to confirm that it is the real deal. Now, when it comes to value, that is where things get particularly exciting with this coin. The Charlton catalog doesn't even assign a value to the 2000P Canadian penny. Because there are only 8 certified examples, there simply isn't enough market data. There are very few or no recorded public sales that have taken place in recent years, so we don't have auction results that we can lean on. But if we look at similar coins from the year 2000, for example, the 2000P dime and the 2000P Canadian quarters, we can get an idea of its value. The 2000P dime and 2000P quarters were both struck under similar circumstances, and they have sold for thousands of dollars when they appear at auction. And based on those results, I would say that if a 2000P Canadian penny were to cross the auction block today, it could bring anywhere from easily $5,000 to $10,000, especially if it was in a high mint state. Now let's get into the exact values for the 2000 Canadian pennies. For comparison, here's how the 3 different versions stack up. First, you have the regular issue 2000 Canadian penny. For the most part, these coins are not worth anything above their face value. They can be worth around $1 for an MS63 and all the way up to $35 for an MS67. So not even really worth the grading fee of setting them in, even if they are in tip-top shape. And then we have the 2000 Winnipeg Mint Canadian penny. These are worth around $2.90 for an MS63, and they can be worth around $40 for an MS67. They are pretty unique and desirable, as you don't come across Canadian coins with a W Mint mark too often, and they do slightly resemble the American West Point minted coins, so it's pretty cool that we have our own W minted coins here in Canada. And if you do ever find one of them, you should definitely hold on to it anyways, because it is an NIFC, meaning that it came out of a set. And then we have the super rare 2000P Canadian penny. Now, there are no listed values anywhere that I could find for this piece, but I would say, based on my opinion, that if you were to find one and it was in a high mint state, so MS63 to MS65, you could easily get $5,000 to $10,000. So even if you find one of these and it's pretty beat up and been put through the meat grinder, you're at least going to be getting a couple $100s for it. So if you happen to come across any Canadian pennies, definitely check all of your 2000 dated pennies for that little P mint mark on the back. And even if you find any with the W mint mark, it is still a nice little bonus. While the regular 2000 and 2000 Winnipeg Mint Canadian pennies are quite common and accessible, the 2000P sits in an entirely different category. It is a true unicorn in modern Canadian coinage, and it is one of those mythical rarities that most collectors will only dream of finding. For the lucky few that own one, it is not just a coin, it is definitely a crown jewel piece in their collection, and these rarely come up for sale or auction. The 2000P Canadian pennies tell the story of a simple, cost-saving experiment that produced one of the rarest modern coins in Canadian numismatics. They mark the transition to a new era of minting technology, and that makes them stand apart from their more common counterparts and reminds us that sometimes the smallest coins carry the biggest stories. In the year 1996, the Royal Canadian Mint changed the composition of Canadian 1-cent coins due to the increasing price of copper. They started testing new coins made of steel and using a new production method called multiply plating, which combines nickel and copper layers over a steel core. This method was also used for coins in other countries. The Royal Canadian Mint is innovative and offers a solution to save money without compromising quality. Coins produced with this method had a P added below the Queen's bust from the year 2001 to 2006, which was later replaced by the Royal Canadian Mint logo in the year 2006. The Canadian Mint also adapted this new technique for producing coins for various foreign countries, including Papua New Guinea, New Zealand, Ghana, Oman, Paraguay, Barbados, the Bahamas, and even more. This technique has several advantages, such as saving time and materials by using less nickel, copper, or bronze than other minting techniques. It is also faster than single ply plating. Additionally, nickel plate resists tarnishing better than cupronickel and ferritic stainless steel. The multiply plating technique also provides heightened security by customizing the thickness of each copper and nickel layer to create a unique electromagnetic signature, which prevents vending machine fraud. So between the years of 2000 and 2006, it was quite an experimental time at the Royal Canadian Mint for Canadian pennies, and because of this, 6 different varieties were actually created for the Canadian 2006 penny, and amongst those, there is a Holy Grail penny that can be worth crazy amounts of money. In the past, I've discussed some of the Holy Grail coins that have been discovered or that you can actually find, but there are a few modern coins that are as rare and valuable as the 2006 P non-magnetic Canadian penny. The thing about this coin is that you actually have a decent chance of finding one of them if you hunt pennies regularly. I have actually heard of Canadian coin roll hunters stumbling upon this rare gem. It is honestly one of the most well-known and looked for pennies in Canada that you actually have a decent chance of finding eventually. In terms of its scarcity, this penny actually reminds me a lot to the 1922 to 1925 George V pennies. These pennies, although extremely rare and hard to come by, are not impossible to find, and even in low-grade examples of both the 2006 P non-magnetics and also some of the early 1920s small pennies, they can all be worth minimum of $20 to $30, even at the bottom of their grading tier. So very similar values and scarcity for these Canadian pennies. So stay tuned, because I'm definitely going to be making some videos in the future on those early 1920s Canadian small cents. They can be worth just absolutely insane money. But what do you say we discuss the values and specifications of these 2006 Canadian pennies? Because as I mentioned, there are 6 different varieties, and some of them can be worth some okay money, some of them can be worth pretty much face value, and some of them can be worth a whole heck of a lot of money. And I'm also going to talk briefly about an extremely valuable 2005 Canadian penny out of a proof set that you should definitely have on your radar as well. So let's get into the values of these coins. I'm going to start with these 2005s because they're actually a little bit easier. Now, in terms of value, the 2005s are not too rare or too valuable, at least to find the business strikes or circulation examples. But there exists an extremely rare and valuable variety for the 2005 Canadian pennies, and it is actually a proof strike, and that is the 2005 P non-magnetic Canadian proof penny. Now, just to give you guys an idea of the values of the 2005 Canadian pennies, the 2005 regular Canadian proof strike, so no P mint mark, is worth around $1.95 for a PL64 example, and can be worth around $40 for a PL67. The 2005 P from the proof sets, the magnetic example, is worth around $1.45 for a PL64 and can be worth all the way up to $32.90 for a PL67. And then we have the 2005 P non-magnetic. Now, this thing is a holy grail. Your chance of finding it in a coin roll hunt is pretty much slim to nil, but never say never. I have seen much crazier things happen. Your best chance of finding one of these 2005 P non-magnetic Canadian proof pennies is to carry a magnet around with you, go to coin shops, flea markets, maybe check Facebook Marketplace or Kijiji and look for 2005 Canadian proof sets with P mint marks. And basically you just got to throw that magnet onto the penny, and if it doesn't stick to the penny, you might have a holy grail coin that can be worth $1,150 for a PL64 and all the way up to $3,290 for a PL67. This is one of the holy grails of the modern Canadian pennies. There were very few examples struck, so definitely keep your eyes out for 2005 P proof sets. And if you have a magnet with you, maybe just give that penny a little tap, and if it doesn't stick, then you might have a jackpot on your hands. All right, so what do you say we start going through the 2006 pennies? I'm going to discuss the compositions as well as some of the identifying factors of these pennies, so that way you can find the ones that are worth good money, because there are 2 of the 2006 pennies that can be extremely rare and valuable. So the first one that we are going to discuss is not going to be one of the rare ones, and that is the 2006 with a P mint mark, and this is a magnetic example. So to identify this, you want to flip over to the obverse and look for a little P mint mint mark under the bust of the Queen. It will also have a magnetic steel planchette. Now, in terms of value, it's worth around 5 cents for an MS60, so pretty much worth face value at the bottom of the MS scale, maybe slightly more. And this one can be worth $73.70 for an MS67 example, which is an extremely high grade example. Now, next up, we're actually going to discuss the rarest and most valuable of the 2006 Canadian pennies, and that is the 2006p non-magnetic. So basically, to identify this one, you want to flip over to the obverse of the coin and look for a little P mint mark under the bust of the Queen. This coin will have a non-magnetic copper planchette. Now, one of the great things about the rare 2006 pennies that also makes them one of the most searched for pennies here in Canada when it comes to coin roll hunting is that they actually have a pretty decent value on the low end. Now, the 2006p non-magnetic can be worth around $40 for a VF12, so that is pretty much at the bottom of the Sheldon scale. Even if it is absolutely beat up, sat in a parking lot, you're going to be getting $10 or $20 for this coin. People want them for their collection, and even though they are out there, they are honestly a unicorn and you almost never stumble across them. So as I mentioned, this 2006p non-magnetic can be worth around $40 for a VF example. It can be worth $132 for an almost uncirculated 50. And then on the high end, it can be worth $500 for an MS60 and all the way up to $2,000 for an MS65. This is a fairly recent penny. I have found coins much older in a high mint state before, so your chances of finding one of these and it actually being in decent condition is not too terrible, honestly. So always keep your eyes out for the 2006 pennies and throw your 2006 Ps to the side. Check them with the magnet, and if that magnet does not stick, then you have yourself one extremely rare coin. Now, next we'll get into the 2006s with the Royal Canadian Mint logo. Now, there is a non-magnetic and a magnetic. Neither of these are particularly rare or valuable. The first we will discuss is the 2006 non-magnetic with the Royal Canadian Mint logo under the bust. To identify it, you want to flip over to the obverse, look for the Royal Canadian Mint logo under the Queen's bust, and this will have a non-magnetic copper planchette. In terms of value, it's worth around 10 cents for an MS60. It can be worth up to $45.30 for an MS67, which is an extremely high grade. And then we have the 2006 Royal Canadian Mint logo with a magnetic planchette. To identify this, you want to flip over to the obverse, look for that Royal Canadian Mint logo under the Queen's bust. It will have a magnetic steel planchette, and it can be worth around $1.95 for an MS60 and around $177 for an MS67. So this is definitely the rare of the two varieties, and it may be a good idea to pull a few of these to the side if you're a coin roll hunter. The 2006 Royal Canadian Mint magnetic seems to be the rare and more valuable of the two. And the last two varieties for the Canadian 2006 pennies that we are going to discuss today are the 2006s without any mint marks. Now, just like the previous four pennies mentioned, there is a magnetic and non-magnetic example for the 2006 Canadian penny with no mint mark. The rare one of the two is the 2006 magnetic. First, we'll discuss the 2006 non-magnetic. Now, to identify this, you want to flip over to the obverse of the coin, and there will be no P or no logo of the Royal Canadian Mint mark under the Queen's bust, and it will also have a non-magnetic copper planchette. In terms of value, it's worth around 5 cents for an MS60 example, and can be worth around $47 for an MS67. So very similar prices on the high end for the more common of the 2006 coins. And then we have the second of the Holy Grail 2006 pennies, and that is the 2006 magnetic no mint mark. Now, to identify this, you want to flip over to the obverse of the coin, and you are looking for no mint mark under the Queen's bust. It will have a magnetic steel planchette. Now, it was not made in sets, it was only released in circulation. I have still yet to find either of these two of the rare 2006 pennies, but I shall keep looking, and maybe, just maybe, I will have my day. In terms of value, the 2006 magnetic no mint mark can be worth around $75 for an MS60 and all the way up to $863 for an MS67. This one isn't super valuable on the low end. It can be worth around $10 to $20. If it's in a low grade state, people still really want it for their collections. And because you almost never stumble across these things in the wild, people are always willing to pay a premium to add them to their collection. If you ever did find one of these, I would suggest trying to sell it on maybe eBay or Facebook Marketplace. That's usually where you get the most amount of money for these coins. You can maybe try taking it to your local coin shop, but they're usually not interested in varieties like this. They might pay you like a couple dollars or something like that if you're lucky. But your best bet for coins like this is to sell it on eBay or maybe an online auction to get the premium that you are hoping for. If you happen to have any Canadian pennies lying around, I suggest you pull them out and take a little look through them, because believe it or not, there's one subtle detail on Canadian pennies from the years 1953 to 1955 that can make the difference between pocket change and the find of a lifetime. Before we discuss the 1955 pennies, first, I need to explain one of the most important design quirks that can be found in Canadian numismatics, and that is the shoulder fold versus the no shoulder fold varieties. These tiny differences, although small and subtle, could mean the difference between big bucks, so let's break it all down. It all started on February 6, 1952, when Queen Elizabeth II first ascended the throne after the death of her father, King George VI. That year, Canadian coins still featured King George VI's effigy, but the Canadian Mint needed a brand new portrait for 1953, and they had to get it just right. 17 plaster models of the new Queen's effigy were submitted from around the world, and after some deliberation, the Royal Mint in London chose the now iconic uncrowned portrait by sculptor Mary Gillick. But here's where things get interesting. For the first time ever, Canada was allowed to create its own obverse master tools directly from the artist's model, rather than using the dies from London. This was considered a historic move by the Canadian Mint, but it led to technical difficulties in producing the obverse portrait designs for Canadian coins. When production began, something became clear very quickly, and that is the relief of the Queen's portrait was too high. This meant that the finer details weren't striking properly, especially the fold in the gown on Queen Elizabeth II's shoulder. That is where Thomas Shingles, who was the Royal Canadian Mint's chief engraver at the time, stepped in. He retouched the design, adjusting the Queen's gown to better emphasize the fold, also known as the strap. This led to the creation of two distinct varieties of coins. Now, the easiest way to identify the difference between the shoulder fold and the no shoulder fold on your Canadian coins isn't actually to look at the shoulder itself, it is to look at a single letter on the obverse of the coin. What you want to do is flip over to the obverse and look at the letter I in the word DEI, which is part of the Latin inscription DEI Gratia. If the ends of the letter I are flared out and come to points, then it is the no shoulder fold variety. If the letter I is straight and blunt with no flaring contrast, then you have the regular shoulder fold coin. There are a few different methods for identifying the difference between the shoulder fold and no shoulder fold, but even on worn coins, this trick works like magic, and it is the go-to method for experienced collectors. The shoulder fold and no shoulder fold cent varieties even continued into the years 1954 and 1955, making those years just as collectible if you know what to look for. So why do collectors and numismatists care so much about this incredibly subtle difference? Well, it's an incredibly important part of Canadian numismatic history. One reason is because it was the first new monarch featured on coin designs in over a decade. This also marked a pivotal period when Canada became even more independent and less reliant on Britain for its coin production, which actually led to the mishap which created this variety. Now, depending on the denomination, year, condition, and whether it is the no shoulder fold or shoulder fold, the value of your coin can vary significantly. In some cases, the rarer no shoulder fold varieties fetch extreme premiums, especially in high grades. Even if your coin isn't worth a fortune, sometimes it's just fun being able to identify a hidden variety with nothing more than your eyes or zooming in with your phone, and being able to identify this variety with no more than your eyes and a little bit of numismatic know-how. The 1953 shoulder fold versus no shoulder fold debate might seem like a small detail, but in the world of Canadian coin collecting, small differences can mean everything. So the next time you're going through your change or your grandparents' coin jar, pay close attention to the I in the DEI on 1953 to 1955 Canadian coins, because it just might be the tiny clue that reveals a hidden gem. The 1955 no shoulder fold Canadian penny is one of the most desirable varieties in modern Canadian numismatics. While both the shoulder fold and the no shoulder fold varieties were struck in the year 1955 for the Canadian 1-cent coin, it is the no shoulder fold version that stands out for its rarity and collector appeal. This coin has become especially sought after due to its limited mintage and the visual subtlety that separates it from its more common counterpart. Now, the key difference between the two different varieties lies on the obverse in the coin, specifically in the inscription DEI Gratia. Now, as I mentioned previously, to identify which version of these coins you have, you want to look at the last letter of I in the word DEI. On the rarer no shoulder fold variety, the I will have flared or pointed ends, giving it a delicate serif-like appearance. On the shoulder fold version, which was introduced later that year to strengthen the design and reduce the die wear, the eye is blunt and squared, often described as straight or flat at the ends. Despite the name, the so-called shoulder fold actually refers to a thicker neckline or shoulder strap on the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, but it is the I in the DEI that gives collectors the clearest, fastest way to tell the two apart. Now, even for the most seasoned of collectors, finding a genuine 1955 no shoulder fold penny would feel like hitting the jackpot. But what if I told you that there is a lesser known variety that could increase the value of these coins, known as the Hanging 5? So far, the Hanging 5 variety has only been discovered on the more common 1955 shoulder fold penny. This variety is named for a small hook-like line that appears just above and to the left of the digit 5 in the date on the reverse side of the coin. This line resembles a thread or crack hanging from the top of the 5, hence the name the Hanging 5 variety. This subtle anomaly is likely the result of a die crack, which is a defect that occurs when a minting die develops a fracture or crack, transferring the unintended raised mark onto each subsequent coin that it strikes. While minor die cracks are relatively common in older coins, the specific position and shape of this one has caught the attention of collectors. Now, I'm not too sure what was going on at the Canadian Mint in the late 50s and the 1960s, but you can find all sorts of hanging digit varieties for lots of the different penny dates, and that includes 1962, 1963, and several more. I'm probably going to be covering some of those in a future video, so if you would like to see those, stay tuned. On its own, a Hanging 5 error on the less rare 1955 shoulder fold penny can give the coin a small value boost. However, if a Hanging 5 were ever confirmed on a no shoulder fold penny, which is a variety that's already prized for its rarity, the combination of these two anomalies could create a truly exceptional piece, possibly even a holy grail for Canadian small cent collectors. It would represent a crossover of both rarity and minting flaws that is incredibly hard to come by, and no such example has officially been documented yet. Whether you're new to coin collecting or a seasoned veteran, learning to identify these varieties is a skill worth having and mastering. Always check your 1955 pennies under good lighting or zoom in with your phone. You want to look at the last I in the word DEI on the obverse of the coin to determine if you have the shoulder fold or no shoulder fold variety. With so many pennies still floating around in collection jars, flea markets, and coin shops, the next great discovery could be sitting in someone's change jar just waiting to be discovered right now. Now, if you do think you have found a legitimate 1955 no shoulder fold penny, especially one with a possible hanging 5, it is definitely a smart move to have it authenticated by a reputable third-party grading service like ICCS, PCGS, or NGC. And if you really believe that you may have found this coin and you are pretty sure that it is the variety that I am discussing, you could even take it into your local coin shop to get a second opinion. Confirming the coin's authenticity and also its condition is the first and most important step to realizing its full value. Now, before we do get into the values for the 1955 pennies, some of the details and specifications. If any of these are off, it may indicate that it is not an authentic example. The overall mintage for the Canadian 1955 penny is 56,403,193. That includes both the shoulder fold and no shoulder fold varieties. It is composed of 98% copper, 0.5% tin, and 1.5% zinc. It has a weight of 3.24 grams, a diameter of 19.05 millimeters. It has a current copper melt value of 3 cents Canadian per penny. The obverse was designed and engraved by Mary Gillick and the reverse by G.E. Kruger Gray, and the die-axis is in metal alignment, which is the standard for most Canadian, British, and Australian coins. Now, what do you say we get into the values for the different Canadian 1955 penny varieties? First, we will start with the most common, which is the 1955 shoulder fold. So to identify this, you want to look at the last I in DEI on the obverse of the coin, and if it looks straight and blunt, then it is the shoulder fold, which is the most common. It can be worth around 4 to 30 cents for a circulated example. It can be worth around $11 for an MS64, and it can be worth all the way up to $1,250 for an MS67. And that might seem like a pretty good value, but to be honest, you're probably not going to be finding many 1955 pennies that are in that good of shape anymore. The next variety that we are going to discuss is the 1955 shoulder fold, and that is the hanging 5 variety. So once again, to identify the hanging 5 heir, what you want to do is look at the last digit of 5 and the date of 1955 on the reverse of the coin, and you want to look for a small hook-like line that is running from the top of the 5 and to the left. Now, if you can identify this on the more common shoulder fold variety, it can be worth around $18 for an MS64, so slightly more valuable than the more common shoulder fold without the hanging 5. And then last but not least, we have the 1955 no shoulder fold, which is the rarest and most valuable of the 1955 penny varieties that are currently known to exist. Now, if you are able to find the no shoulder fold variety on a 1955 penny, it can be worth around $150 to $600 for an even well-worn and circulated example. So even if this thing has been beat up and been put through the meat grinder, you're still going to be able to get around $100 for this coin. Even if you aren't able to get it graded, if you were able to find one of these and you posted it on an auction site, even like eBay, I don't doubt that you could easily get $100, as people probably want this to fill out their books and collections. If you are able to find one of these and it scores around the MS64 mark, it can be worth anywhere from $6,000 to $7,000. Now, just to give you guys a comparison, the regular shoulder fold variety is only worth around $18 in that same grade. So that is a massive, massive price increase. Now, I wasn't able to find any quotes or estimates for any higher grades than an MS64, but I don't doubt if it did score any higher, then you could get easily around $10,000 for the 1955 no shoulder fold Canadian penny. Now, as I mentioned previously, there currently aren't any of these known to exist with the hanging 5 variety, but if you were able to identify a hanging 5 on a no shoulder fold penny, it could make its value skyrocket. We could be talking a $50,000 coin, because having both of those attributes would make it a one-of-a-kind piece. Now, what do you guys think about the 1955 no shoulder fold Canadian penny? What would you do if you ever found one, or if you ever have found any of the coins that I discussed in this video? Please let me know down in the comments. I would love to know. Also, I would really appreciate if you guys would smash that thumbs up, subscribe if you're new, and ring that bell notification so you can follow along with my new content as it is being released. But I think that is pretty much going to do it for this one, folks. So until the next one, everybody, peace out and have a good one, y'all.